What's going on, everybody? Greg Moyer here, joined by Chris Annunzio today.
What's up?
We're going to do a special episode of Young Bucks on the restaurant industry. So we've got a lot of data together. This is a video I've wanted to do for a long time, and we decided, hey, makes sense. Let's go to an actual restaurant. So here we are at an undisclosed location on Marietta Square, and we're going to talk a little bit about the sub-minimum wage versus federal minimum wage, kind of all the economics of the restaurant industry, specifically the full-service restaurant industry. So kind of to give you a little bit of background, there's about 1 million restaurant businesses in the United States, and we'll obviously give you some sources for this stuff where we get this information. And there's almost 15 million people in the workforce, which if you look at the total participation rate and employment in the workforce, that's about 10% of the workforce. So really 1 in 10 people that have a job works in the restaurant industry. So it's a good chunk of people. Now, on top of that, only 7 states have an actual sub-minimum wage that is equal to the federal minimum wage. So you might hear a lot, federal minimum wage is $7.25, right? A lot of states, they have the control over what the actual minimum wage is. So a lot of states are higher, but federally mandated has to be $7.25. So as you may have heard your whole life in the restaurant industry, what's this? Servers make $2.13 an hour, right? So that's what we refer to as the sub-minimum wage. And really, we're going to try to point out the economics of why that's bad for the industry as a whole and for the consumer. I'd say mainly for the consumer. So Chris and I both have a little bit of service industry experience. We've worked at full-service restaurants. I've worked in fast food. I don't know if you have.
No, I haven't. I've worked in a variety of other restaurants, though.
Right. So, Chris, if you want to give us a little bit of background on maybe a full-service restaurant you worked at where you were a server, right?
Yeah, definitely.
So give us a little background on how that was for you. And
All right, so it should be noted that every restaurant I've worked in, I was also, in college taking classes, as were a lot of my coworkers.
Right.
So with scheduling, do you want to jump into that topic?
Yeah, scheduling is good.
All right, so with scheduling, it's a little bit difficult because there's just such a high turnover in some of the restaurants that I've worked at, and more particularly the corporate ones than the mom and pop shops that I've worked at.
Big surprise there.
Yeah, big surprise. But yeah, so there's a higher turnover, and I think a lot of the reason for it was scheduling. You have a lot of people in management positions that maybe didn't have as much as they didn't have the experience that it took to be in a position where they would be essentially delegating who does what and at what points in times and how to make everything fair. So what I found a lot of the times, it was basically picking favorites. So if
Right.
you're on the boss's good side, then you're going to get the Friday night, Saturday night shift, the Sunday night shift, the good ones, where
Right,
you're
right.
leaving with a pocket full of money.
The money making shit.
And if you're a college student who can't, pick up someone's slack, or you have your set schedule and you have what you need to do, and then you gave them a set schedule, a lot of the times what you'll find is you'll get the lunch shifts, the ones where you spend $10 getting to the restaurant, you go to work, you make your $12, so profit $2, and then you spend that getting home.
Right.
And so a lot of the time, that was my experience with the restaurants as far as corporate restaurants are concerned.
Yeah. So, and that's that's a good point, especially when you think about all those costs and even getting to work. And it's a lot of times can be, that's the problem, is you don't know what you're going to go and make that day.
Right.
So that becomes a little bit of an issue. And so Department of Labor and the Bureau of Labor Statistics, they come out every year with, the highest paying jobs, lowest paying jobs, median income, all that good stuff. And a lot of times, sometimes 6, 7, even 8 out of 10 of those lowest paying jobs tend to be in the restaurant industry. And there's a couple of reasons behind that. So let's say, as Chris talked about, working as a server, you're making $2.13 an hour. I think it's kind of understood that you're going to make more than minimum wage, right? That's kind of the goal. And then, you might point to, well, if you do a good job and there's good service, you get tipped more, et cetera, right?
That's the scheme of it.
Right,
yeah.
that's the scheme. And I think you would maybe hear from a lot of people, oh, I'm tipping well because they make $2.13 an hour and all that. So kind of want to highlight why that is a little misguided in kind of the thought pattern there. Mostly because when you look at the employer is paying $2.13 an hour, and then the consumer, which is you, when you go out to the restaurant and you spend money, you're making up the rest of that wage, right? Now, of course, if you had a bad day and you don't get any tips. The employer has to pay out up into the federal minimum wage, which is $7.25 an hour, right? But in a lot of cases, we've got people that make at least minimum wage, if not a little bit more. So if we look at some stats from ROC United, which is a good source that we got a lot of data from, and they usually will pull from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and a lot of high-level government data. So we feel like we can trust it. So the restaurant industry, the workforce is estimated to live 2.5 times the general population in poverty. So they're 2.5 times more likely to live in poverty than the rest of the workforce, the overall workforce, not just in the restaurant industry. And nearly half of the families of full-service restaurant workers are enrolled in public assistance programs. So that's anything from, earned income tax credits, food stamps, the SNAP program, child health care insurance program, lots of Section 8 housing. So lots of those programs, when you have nearly half of that workforce and their families enrolled in those programs, now it starts to make a little bit more sense where it's almost a double subsidy where you come into a restaurant and you pay the server's wage and you say, oh, I'm tipping well because they make $2.13 an hour. And on top of that, you might not realize it, but you might be paying a lot in your tax dollars indirectly as well. ROC United estimates from these government statistics that the restaurant industry costs taxpayers $9 billion a year for these public assistance programs. So when you think about that starts to kind of gear the conversation somewhere else. And I don't know, what do you think about that, Chris? Those numbers of,
man,
we're paying the living wage, right?
Definitely.
And the employer's not. But then on top of that, $9 billion in taxpayer money a year to fund public assistance programs for these workers.
I think that I would probably share the same sentiments as anyone else who knows this statistic, and that it's wrong. So with the same ROC website, they had another statistic where each Olive Garden costed taxpayers $196,970 annually.
So that's each location.
That's every location.
That's the tax.
Do that
incentive.
math.
Well, not tax incentive. That's the tax
burden.
Burden, yeah. Wow.
Definitely. So it really adds up. And then on top of that, that's just taxpayers. So the consumers are also paying for those people.
Right.
And then they're also getting, tax benefits as well, which they should be. I mean, they're not. I don't want to say that, working at a restaurant, $7.25, it's a stepping stone job. So people say, I don't want to think of it as, it's a remedial job, so you shouldn't be getting paid a lot.
Right.
But I mean, you're talking $7.25. That's barely livable.
Oh, it is. And so what's interesting about that? So like the last time the federal minimum wage at $7.25, the last time that went up was 2009, right?
Right.
So when you just think about it, inflation alone, just inflation, not anything else like cost of everything else going up, but just inflation, that $7.25 an hour since 2009, almost the last 10 years, that money has lost almost 10% of its buying power from inflation. So, and in 2009, $7.25 was tough to live on, right? So it hasn't gone up. Now, to further highlight the issue, that $2.13 an hour hasn't risen since 1991. Now, that's not all the states. Like I said, 7 states they actually match the federal minimum wage at $7.25. And then there's a number of other states that maybe it's $3, $4, $5, even $6 an hour. Still doesn't quite meet that federal minimum wage, but it at least is higher than $2.13. And I would say a big reason why that $2.13 an hour hasn't changed since 1991 is the National Restaurant Association. And you could look at Darden restaurants and stuff too. So they call it in the community, this is they refer to as the other NRA. So they spend a lot of money lobbying Congress to keep that $2.13 an hour where it is, right? So I think last year for 2017, I think they spent about $3.2 million lobbying Congress. They usually gear towards Republicans. That's where most of their donations come from. I think Republicans receive about 70%, 60 to 70% of their donations on average each cycle. But they spend a couple $1 million a year lobbying to keep that where it is. And on top of that, they talk about, no paid sick days. That's something that's obviously very contentious and contentious in the industry, of not having access to healthcare, not having access to paid sick days, which really in the restaurant industry means that you got to work when you're sick.
Yeah, and you add it up, is a lot of the jobs that I've worked, you hit 40 hours and they'll clock you out right there on the spot. Doesn't matter if you have tables. They're not paying you overtime.
39 hours is usually
overtime. They're not paying you $4.26 an hour, guys.
No.
Let's
right.
Now we're getting too extreme.
That's not going to happen.
But yeah. It also should be noted when we're talking about $2.13 an hour. Primarily, we're talking about servers. I know that bartenders typically will get paid more than that, maybe like four and some change, 5 and some change. But
right, and it varies, and that's one of those things too, where the employer can be in a bit of a difficult situation there, where they go, do I take advantage of the way it works? And I say, well. Especially if you have like a high volume restaurant where people are making a lot of money in tips. Sure, there's always that random Tuesday night where no one's there, or it rains, or there's a lot of factors, of course. Somebody's got to work lunch,
right?
But somebody has
it's always me.
Yeah. So that's where the employer has that dilemma of, do I just pay what's mandated at the state and federal level? Or do I try and go above and beyond and say, let me pay my workers more, and they'll make more, they'll get more tips, there'll be less turnover, they'll like working here? Because then, the restaurant industry, those margins are so thin. It's not like they're making millions of dollars per location, like a week. The margins are so thin that you almost are going to put yourself out of business, especially as a smaller competitor. You're almost going to put yourself out of business if you're going to pay more than that $2.13 an hour. So the idea being, the framework here is, a lot of people would say, yes, I tip well because of that $2.13 an hour. And that's right. I think that's the right thing to do, because sure, they should get paid more. But I think that their reasoning is a little misguided, because they don't really ever call into question, like, well, why is it that way? Why is it that I have to pay the wage and the employer doesn't? I don't think that's a question a lot of people ask themselves.
I think it's a very important question that people don't ask themselves.
And then when we pile on that double subsidy we've been talking about, where a $9 billion a year tax burden on the public, that it really starts to add up.
Yeah, it's pretty brutal.
Yeah.
And then someone out there, someone on the top of this chain is crawling in money hand over fist. So
big time.
It hurts to think
the other
about.
NRA, man.
Yeah.
we'll put some stats up of what their executives pull in and bonuses while they're getting away with. So Darden, especially Darden, you've got Olive Garden and
Longhorn Steakhouse, Red Lobster.
If you've ever gotten one of those gift cards and you see on the back it says you can use this at Longhorns or Olive Garden, or they don't own Red Lobster anymore, actually.
Oh, they don't?
As a couple of years ago, I guess they were bought out. But the other thing to point out too is the National Restaurant Association is usually the number 2 donor in political contributions every year. The only company that really spends more lobbying dollars than them is usually Coca-Cola.
I was about to say.
In food and beverage, just in the food and beverage category, right? The NRA would be number 2, and then after that you have like McDonald's and Yum Brands and a couple other those. Now the National Restaurant Association represents about 500,000 restaurant businesses, right?
Yeah.
Which, as we said earlier, there's roughly 1 million restaurant locations in the United States. So they basically represent half of the restaurants out there, right? McDonald's are represented by the National Restaurant Association. Yum Brands. I mean, some of these top 5, top 10 donors every year that lobby Congress to keep things the way they are, they're all kind of under that blanket of the NRA anyways.
Mm-hmm. So on average, each family spends around $3,000 per year eating out, and that's a Bureau of Labor Statistics, Department of Labor. And then in addition to that, the restaurant industry, as of 2017, was making $800 billion.
$800 billion for the year, huh?
Yeah, that's a fact.
That's a large number.
And so I guess since they're growing so rapidly, and since that industry is so profitable, is that something that you think we're ever going to want to change, or is it something that that we should just let run rampant? Because
right,
I mean, it's not broke, don't fix it.
Right. I think that's a good point, and it's a good question, because if you were to say tomorrow, hey, let's do away with tipping altogether and let's raise that sub minimum wage of $2.13 an hour. Let's raise it to $7.25 at least to meet the minimum wage on the federal level. Mm-hmm. It's not going to happen. It's not feasible because, one, people aren't going to stop tipping, which would be a good thing because if the server's making $7.25 now and getting tips, maybe they're closer to that 14, 15, 16 an hour, somewhat livable versus the $7.25. But, and on top of that, it's not going to change because it doesn't suit the corporate interest. And not to be, big brother conspiracy theorist, but, the NRA spends those lobbying dollars intentionally.
Those go somewhere.
I mean, since 1991, that 213 hasn't gone up. So when you look at it that way, I don't know. I mean, if we had the federal minimum wage hike in 2009 and it's up to $7.25, but we haven't had any movement on the sub minimum wage since 1991. I think that's very intentional. I don't really know what the solution is. I think in an ideal world, you at least get to $7.25 and there's still tipping. Now, maybe that's an issue because now the restaurant says, well, our cost of labor is higher by however many, what percentage is that? 213 to 725. Right. So our cost of labor is higher. The items in the menu are going up. Now you're going to have to come out and pay more.
Well, I was thinking, when you hear about McDonald's workers, going on strike saying we want $15 an hour, how easy would it be for McDonald's to be like, we don't need you. We could just, here's an iPad, we could just automate this process, streamline the whole thing.
That's probably where they'll end up going with it.
You think so?
Yeah. Or they cycle in the new kids that don't know how to be opinionated about it just yet,
Right. And that of course isn't the same with a sit down restaurant because I think people crave human interaction and that's one element that you can't take away from a sit down restaurant.
And then, when you think too, I think a lot of people would say, I'll generalize, I think a lot of people would say, oh, well, if we do away with tipping altogether and we pay servers and people in the restaurant industry a fair wage, the service is going to get worse. There's no incentive for them to work harder, to serve me, to come fill up my drink, to come ask if I want another drink. There's no incentive for them to do that.
Let me tell you my thoughts on that though. While we're on it, is I think that from a server's point of view, I've done it in the past. My goal is to get you in and get you out as fast as possible.
Exactly.
And what does that mean? That means more money in my pocket.
It's like, I look at it like planes. When the plane's in the air, it's not making money.
Right.
When the plane's on the runway, no one's getting on. It's not making money.
Right. And so
same thing with the table.
It's all about turnover.
There, I'm not making money.
Right. And so I think it would actually raise the standard a little bit, in my opinion, just because, how many times have you been given a bill and say, oh, just pay when you're ready, but your server's giving you the eye of like, come on, man, you've been here for 45 minutes. It's time to go. I think that you wouldn't have that experience if there was an hourly wage. Let the couple, sit down and drink coffee for however long they want.
Right.
Doesn't that improve the quality of their experience? They're more comfortable the whole time. They're not getting rushed. I think that would actually benefit the consumer.
I think you might be right. You might have a little less confusion in the kitchen when orders are going out to the wrong table and things are wrong. Because you don't have to rush them out of there as quick. The whole operation can kind of work a little more appropriately.
Smoothly.
That's a really good point, too, with the service that's one of those things that are perception versus reality. We might say, oh, yeah, the service would go downhill if we didn't have to tip or if we weren't expected to tip. But in the 7 states that have that equal sub-minimum and minimum wage, it's not even sub-minimum at that point because it's equal to $7.25. In those 7 states, they're not reporting loss in sales. They're not reporting less engagement with people going out and eating. And actually, they're forecasting a little bit more growth in the industry than the other 43 states that still have below the federal minimum wage. So I don't think there's really much evidence to support the service gets worse. People stop coming out. Sure, on some of the smaller employers, like the place that we're in right now, maybe that would affect their bottom line because, an Olive Garden, people are still going to go there. You know what I mean?
Right.
And the idea
basically a boogeyman.
Sure. The idea of being that, the prices are probably going to go up if they have to pay their employees a livable wage. So that's kind of our thoughts. Like I said, I've wanted to kind of do a video on this for a long time.
Definitely.
Mostly because I think it is a problem, but people are a little misguided in how they look at it. Oh, I'm tipping you well because you make $2.13 an hour. There's a lot more to it than that. The economics of that, where you're not just paying their wage and the employer doesn't have to. You're also paying for their food stamps and their child health care insurance programs, and all that stuff is kind of rolled into one.
Mm-hmm.
Not to say that everybody, but about half of those families need a public assistance program to survive. So, anyways, that's it for us. Let us know in the comments if you have serving experience, if you worked in the restaurant industry. Give us some horror stories. I'm sure there's some good ones. That time that you got that bad shift and you made $0 and then your employer said, I'm not going to pay you up to minimum wage.
Oof.
I'm sure there's a lot of good stories of that.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So leave something in the comments. If you're listening to this podcast, head over to our YouTube page at youtube.com/Tusk Media LLC, and you can find all the sources that we use for this video and audio podcast. Check out those links. There's some really good information there. Thanks for watching.
Tusk Media is a subsidiary of Narwhal Capital Management. Ratings and reviews of Tusk Media content are not to be construed as endorsements of opinions, analysis, or services offered by Tusk or its parent company. The opinions and predictions shared here are our professional beliefs at the time of publication. We are not under duress from any of the corporate entities mentioned. This is not a solicitation to take any particular action. Although we are investment advisors, this information should not be considered investment, legal, or tax advice. We strive to be as impartial, insightful, and accurate as possible. We base our opinions, analysis, and calculations on information we believe to be reliable, but we cannot guarantee its accuracy. We can, however, guarantee that our opinions will sometimes be flat out wrong due to a variety of factors. Employees and clients of Narwhal Capital Management may or may not hold positions in the securities detailed and may or may not hold these positions in the future. A full list of all securities purchased, sold, or held during the 12 months preceding the date of this publication can be provided upon request. Unless otherwise noted, all data accessed via MarketWatch or the Bloomberg terminal. Past performance does not guarantee future results. A copy of Narwhal's Form ADV is available at the SEC's website, www.advisorinfo.sec.gov, or from Narwhal upon written request.